Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen to this class. We will look at one of the psychiatric emergencies, one of the most important. So we have a number of psychiatric emergencies in psychiatry. For the sake of your training, we'll focus on the most important ones. So for today, we will look at suicide, which is also known as parasuicide when it hasn't resulted into death. What others say parasuicide or attempted suicide. So by the end of this class, students should be able to define suicide, also to understand the risk factors of suicide, to tell suicide clues. This is to identify signs of suicide, identify conditions associated to suicide, also to manage patients with suicidal ideations, and also students will be able to provide counseling to suicidal patients. Okay. All right. So the definition for suicide could be an act of intentionally taking one's own life. As simple as that. May also be defined as a willful, self-inflicted, life-threatening act which has resulted into death. When an act hasn't resulted into death, it is termed as parasuicide or attempted suicide. Close to 800,000 people die due to suicide every year globally. You see, the number is high. So this really tells us that it is really a public health problem. For every suicide case there are many more people who attempt suicide every year. So those ones that successfully occur are few compared to those that attempt suicide. A prior suicide attempt is a single most important risk factor. So when someone attempts suicide, that is the greatest risk factor you can ever have. So the possibility of them doing it again is very high, and the second time usually is successful. Suicide is a third leading cause of death in 15 to 19 years olds globally. It is more in divorcees and widows than in singles or never married. 79% of global suicides occur in low and middle income countries. Ingestion of pesticides, hanging, and firearms are among the most common methods of suicide globally. We've seen a number of risk factors there. Divorcees, why is it so? Widows, why is it like that? 15-year to 19-year-olds, why is it like that? Okay, so we will look at the details as we go on. So we have types of suicide. We have this sociologist called Durkheim, who classified suicide into three classes. The first type of suicide is egoistic suicide. In this type of suicide, an individual loses sense of identity and integration within their social group. They no longer feel subject to their social, family, and religious control. So someone feels they don't belong to that group anymore. They don't belong to their family, they don't belong to their religion. And so life for them becomes meaningless and they wish to die. That is egoistic suicide. The second one is anomic suicide. In this type of suicide, an individual who lives in a society that lacks collective order due to social change or political crisis may result into committing suicide. So in this, an individual, in this type of suicide, you find an individual who seem to judge the area where they are staying or the country where they stay to have changed in most cases due to political reasons, maybe change of government, maybe conflicts between political parties, and the society seem to be lacking order. The society seem to be threatening to them, and they eventually commit suicide because of that. That is anomic suicide. The last one is altruistic suicide. Altruistic suicide is a type of suicide where an individual sacrifices oneself for the good of the other group. So we've heard about these people, like in Islam, we've heard of, even in Nigeria, suicide bombers. They would sacrifice their life in order for others to live. They would rather die alone and save the lives of their families. So these are the three types of suicides that we have. So we move on to factors, the risk factors of suicide. We have an acronym here which says SAD persons. So SAD persons is an acronym that gives us a guide on how to develop these risk factors and memorize them. So the first risk factor we have is S, standing for sex. By virtue of one being male or female, there is a degree of risk for one to commit suicide. So, and every type of sex, whether male or female, there's a common method of suicide that is preferred by different sex. So suicide is more in men than in female. But that should not mean that females do not commit suicide. It is just more in men than in women. So just by virtue of being male, you're at high risk of suicide. The second one is age. A standing for age. We have looked at the age between 15 and 19 in the introduction being the ones that commit suicide more because they are still experiencing a lot of challenges in life. They are still trying to identify themselves. They haven't yet found things that are appealing to them. And eventually, if they try something out and they fail, they feel frustrated, they feel like the world hasn't accepted them, or they are not going to succeed no matter how hard they try, they resort into committing suicide. The third risk factor is depression. So depression is the highest risk for suicide in the psychiatric setup. For patients with psychiatric conditions, those ones with depression are at a very high risk. And usually it occurs when the patient regains strength, begins to recover, and that's when they commit suicide. When they are paralyzed, they are weak, they are bedridden, they are unable to execute their plans of suicide. But when they recover, you even give them room to move around freely, thinking they have moved on. That is the time you will know, or rather find out that they have committed suicide. Number 4 risk factor is previous attempts. Every individual who has attempted suicide before is a risk for suicide, is at risk. That individual, any day, anytime, may go back to suicide, and the second attempt is usually successful. The 5th one is ethanol. Ethanol standing for alcohol. So individuals or human beings that take alcohol, usually when they are in that state, they've got altered judgment. Their perception about things change, and eventually they commit suicide in most cases. The next one is R, standing for rational thinking. Most of these acts of suicide that we see are as a result of lack of rational thinking. When someone is not thinking straight, someone is thinking irrationally, being unreasonable, the end result is suicide. S is the next letter in the acronym, standing for social support. Social support is key for people that have got strong bonds in their families with strong social support. They rarely commit suicide. For those that have got weaker ties in their families, those that do not have social support, when they have a problem, they stand on their own without anyone to comfort them, without anyone giving them hope, they end up committing suicide. The next one is organized plan, or standing for organized plan. So organized plan is where an individual begins to plan for suicide before they act upon their idea. Here is an individual who has no property to protect at home, who has no so much wealth, and the wealth which is at risk for theft, just decides to go and get a gun, buys a pistol, and hides it in his bedroom. That is an indication that someone wants to commit suicide. Or rather, here is a person in the village or even in town who doesn't even have a garden at the backyard. You find them buying insecticide. What will that insecticide be for? That is an indication that someone wants to use it to execute their plans of suicide. And usually people who have an organized plan They even know when to do it, how to do it, and where to do it from. The next one is N, non-married. The singles are at high risk for suicide because they've got no one close to them. They've got no one to confide in. In most cases, they keep things to themselves. The majority have their own bedrooms. Whether they are having issues, the families will not know. They will be crying in the night. They will spend sleepless nights. No one would know, unlike the married ones. So the singles, it's difficult, first of all, to identify that this person is going through a lot of problems. Secondly, is that they don't have people whom they can confide in. They don't have that social support as compared to someone who is married. And eventually, when they feel overpowered by their thoughts, by their challenges, they resort into suicide. S stands for sickness. So there are so many sicknesses, especially chronic sicknesses like cancer, HIV, and many other illnesses, even heart diseases. The moment an individual discovers that I can never recover from this an illness, so they will decide to end it all. And that is where our acronym ends, but you can also add family history of suicide. Also is a risk in a family where someone related to that individual committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide. There is a very high risk that that particular person may also attempt or may successfully commit suicide. Unemployment may also be one of the factors because of the increased levels of challenges in society. Okay. So mental illness is a major risk factor for suicide. Suicide is very common in patients with the following conditions. Depression, as already alluded to. Schizophrenia, because of the running commentaries, the patient will be hearing voices telling him to commit suicide before they kill you, do this, go uphill, jump, throw yourself, you can fly, you are a superhero. Those voices will lead to someone committing suicide. The next one is dementia, both senile and presenile dementia. The dementia that occurs in young age and the one that comes in adulthood. As long as there's dementia there, because dementia, a demented patient may have degeneration in the brain and their thinking capacity becomes disturbed and chances of them committing suicide is high. The next one is alcohol abuse. Like already alluded to, when we looked at ethanol, alcohol abuse also is a huge risk for suicide. So under psychiatry or mental illness, alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence syndrome is a risk. Mania is also a risk for suicide because this person will feel like they can fly because of those grandiose ideas. They feel like they are omnipotent. They would climb on top of the building and prove to the people that they can fly. They are an angel. In doing so, they end up dying, and that is suicide. Personality disorders. We have personality disorders like depressive personality. We have personality disorders like paranoid personality disorders. Those are at risk of committing suicide. Anxiety disorders, physical illnesses such as HIV and cancer may also lead one into committing suicide.